The most dangerous criminals are not the ones who panic, not the ones who scream, not the ones who break down the moment a badge flashes in front of them, but the ones who sit calmly, shoulders relaxed, voice steady, eyes observant, because those are the people who believe they understand the system well enough to outmaneuver it. And this story begins with a man like that, a man who walks into a police interview room already convinced that he is several moves ahead of everyone else inside it. Not because he thinks the detectives are stupid, but because he believes he understands how they think, how they manipulate, how they apply pressure, and most importantly, how they make mistakes. And from the very first moment he sits down, he frames the interaction not as an interrogation, but as a negotiation, a psychological chess match where information is currency and silence is power, and he believes he controls both because he has studied the law just enough to know what not to say. He has watched enough interrogations to recognize common tactics, and he has lived long enough around criminal environments to understand how authority operates when it thinks it has leverage. And that confidence is not accidental, it is practiced, reinforced by years of getting away with small things, of talking himself out of consequences, of watching others collapse while he remained composed. And that history shapes his posture now as he leans back slightly in the chair, arms loose, expression neutral, answering initial questions politely but minimally, because in his mind, the first rule of survival is never to give more than is asked. And the detectives notice this immediately, not with alarm, not with frustration, but with interest, because composure is not innocence. It is a data point, and experienced investigators know that intelligence does not make someone safer. It simply changes the way they fall, and the room itself is intentionally unimpressive, no harsh theatrics, no raised voices, no overt intimidation. Just a table, chairs, a recorder, and two detectives who speak calmly and listen more than they talk. And this further reinforces his belief that he is doing well, that the case must be thin, that if they truly had something, the tone would be different, and this assumption becomes his first miscalculation, because strong cases do not rush. They wait, and as the conversation unfolds, he begins to demonstrate exactly why he believes he is smarter, refusing to answer certain questions directly, redirecting others, politely challenging vague phrasing, and even pointing out procedural boundaries, all without aggression, all without appearing uncooperative. And the detectives allow this, not because they are being outplayed, but because every redirection reveals something about how he thinks, what he prioritizes, what he fears, and what he believes is dangerous. And slowly, subtly, the interview shifts from gathering information to mapping psychology, because facts can be hidden but patterns cannot. And as he speaks, he reveals a crucial detail without realizing it. Not about the crime itself, but about his relationship to control, about his need to manage perception, about his belief that as long as he stays logical, emotional consequences cannot reach him. And this belief becomes the foundation of his undoing, because human behavior is not purely logical, especially under sustained observation. And while he believes he is setting boundaries, the detectives are setting timelines, aligning his answers with each other, with known facts, with environmental constraints he has not considered. And the more confident he becomes, the more he talks, because confidence breeds expansion, and expansion creates exposure. And this is where the real danger begins. Not when he slips, but when he feels safe enough to explain, because explanations are where smart criminals betray themselves, layering logic over reality until the layers no longer align, and still, no accusation comes, no confrontation, just calm questions that seem harmless, repetitive even, asked from slightly different angles, and he answers them easily at first, because consistency feels like victory, until it doesn't, until small variations begin to appear, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle shifts, changes in wording, changes in emphasis, changes in certainty, and these shifts are invisible to him because he is focused on performance, not recall. And performance always prioritizes impression over accuracy. And as time passes, fatigue sets in, not physical fatigue, but cognitive fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from maintaining a constructed reality without knowing exactly which pieces matter. And it is in this state that smart criminals make their most consequential errors, not by lying blatantly, but by overcorrecting, by anticipating threats that haven't been introduced, by defending against accusations that haven't been made. And when that happens, the detectives know they no longer need pressure, because pressure would only sharpen his focus, and sharp focus is exactly what they want to avoid. So instead, they slow down, they allow silence. They let him sit with his own thoughts, because silence forces internal dialogue, and internal dialogue reveals priorities, and his priorities are becoming clear. Not innocence, not truth, but control. And control is the one thing the system is designed to remove, not through force, but through inevitability. And as the interview approaches its end, he believes he has succeeded because he has not confessed. He has not been trapped. He has not been confronted, and that belief follows him out of the room, unaware that nothing he said was meant to trap him immediately, because the most effective interrogations do not end with confessions. They end with alignment, and alignment takes time. By the time the second interview begins, the man's confidence has not disappeared, but it has changed shape, evolving from relaxed certainty into calculated vigilance, because now he understands that the detectives are not incompetent, only patient, and patience is more unsettling than aggression. Yet even with this awareness, he still believes he holds the advantage, because nothing irreversible has happened yet. No confession, no accusation, no visible evidence placed on the table, and in his mind, as long as the conversation remains abstract, he remains safe, and this belief is reinforced by the detectives themselves, who return to the room with the same calm demeanor, the same neutral tone, the same unhurried movements, as if nothing has shifted since the first interview. And this continuity lulls him into thinking that whatever progress was made before has stalled, that perhaps they are circling without direction, and this assumption becomes the second major error, because repetition in interrogation is never about stagnation, it is about refinement, about narrowing the field until only one version of reality remains viable. And this time, the questions are not about what happened, but about sequence, about order, about what came before what. And sequence is where intelligent criminals struggle most, because lies can be crafted to explain events, but sequences demand coherence across time, space, and human limitation, and as he begins to walk through the timeline again, he does so confidently, narrating events with a smooth, almost rehearsed rhythm. But this rhythm is precisely what betrays him, because real memory is uneven, fragmented, punctuated by uncertainty, while rehearsed memory flows too cleanly. And the detectives notice this immediately, not as proof, but as signal, and they allow him to continue uninterrupted. Because uninterrupted speech reveals structure, and structure reveals strain, and the strain becomes visible when they ask him to repeat a segment not from beginning to end, but from the middle outward, reversing the direction of recall, a subtle but devastating shift, because reverse recall requires genuine memory, not narrative construction, and his response slows. His words become less precise, his phrasing less confident, and though he does not realize it consciously, his brain is now working harder to maintain consistency than it would to tell the truth. And cognitive load manifests in small ways, in longer pauses, in repeated phrases, in defensive clarifications that were never requested, and the detectives mark each of these silently, because silence remains their strongest ally, and then they introduce something new, not evidence, not accusation, but context, mentioning a mundane detail that seems irrelevant, something environmental, something he assumed no one noticed. And when he responds, his answer reveals a misalignment between his version of events and the physical reality of the setting, not enough to expose him outright, but enough to constrain future explanations, and constraint is the real objective here, because every constraint reduces the number of plausible alternatives left, and the fewer alternatives that remain, the closer inevitability comes. And still, he believes he can adapt, because adaptation has always been his strength, and he begins adjusting his narrative, subtly smoothing rough edges, reinforcing key points. And this adaptive behavior would be impressive if it were not being observed by professionals who understand that adaptation itself is a tell. Because innocent people do not adapt their stories, they recall them, while guilty people refine theirs in response to perceived threat. And the more he adapts, the more his internal model of the situation diverges from the detective's external model, and this divergence grows quietly, invisibly, until it becomes unbridgeable. And at this stage, the detectives shift their approach again, not by increasing pressure, but by reducing interaction, asking fewer questions, allowing longer silences, and this reduction forces him to confront something he has been avoiding, the possibility that he is no longer driving the conversation, and this loss of initiative unsettles him deeply, because control has always been his shield, and without it, he begins to feel exposed, not legally, but psychologically, and in an attempt to regain footing, he volunteers information, offering explanations for things that have not been raised. And this generosity feels strategic to him, but it is reckless, because volunteered information cannot be unspoken, and once spoken, it becomes a permanent reference point, and the detective sees this quietly, anchoring future questions to these volunteered details, and now the net tightens, not through confrontation, but through consistency checks, because consistency is merciless. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply measures. And measurement reveals deviation, and deviation reveals fabrication. And as the interview progresses, his demeanor shifts further, from confident to defensive, from defensive to irritated, because irritation is the emotional response of someone who feels misunderstood rather than accused. And this is significant because innocent people fear consequences, while guilty people fear loss of narrative control. And his irritation surfaces in subtle ways: a sharper tone, a slight impatience, a dismissive laugh at questions he considers redundant, and each of these behaviors further clarifies his psychological profile, painting a picture not of panic, but of entitlement, the belief that his intelligence should exempt him from suspicion, and this belief blinds him to the fact that intelligence does not negate evidence. It only delays confrontation with it, and eventually, the detectives introduce the first undeniable constraint, not as proof, but as a question framed around his own statements, asking him to reconcile two things he has said that cannot both be true. And this is the moment the illusion finally fractures, because he recognizes the inconsistency immediately, even if he cannot resolve it, and his response is instinctive. He laughs it off, minimizes its importance, reframes it as a misunderstanding, and attempts to move past it quickly. But the damage is done, because that moment of recognition, however brief, confirms awareness, and awareness is a powerful indicator of deception, and the detectives do not press further because pressing would invite resistance, and resistance would allow him to fortify, and instead they allow the inconsistency to linger, unaddressed, knowing that unresolved contradictions are far more destabilizing than accusations. And as the interview draws to a close, he leaves with a growing sense of unease. Not fear, not guilt, but uncertainty. And uncertainty is corrosive to someone who relies on control because it forces introspection, and introspection reveals cracks that performance conceals. And over the following days, as he replays the interviews in his mind, he begins to notice those cracks, the moments where answers felt forced, where questions felt heavier than they appeared, where silence felt longer than it should have. And this delayed realization marks the true turning point. Because from this moment on, he is no longer confident, he is cautious, and caution changes behavior, and behavior leaves patterns, and patterns are detectable, and when the detectives finally move forward, they do so not with drama, not with spectacle, but with quiet certainty, because everything they need has already been established, not through tricks, not through manipulation, but through observation, patience, and alignment. And when he is confronted with the full picture, not as accusation, but as conclusion, he understands something too late, something fundamental about intelligence and power, that being smarter than the detectives was never the goal, because the detectives were never trying to outthink him. They were allowing him to reveal exactly how he thinks, and that knowledge was far more valuable than any confession could ever be, because confessions can be retracted, but patterns cannot. And in the end, the story does not conclude with a dramatic breakdown, but with quiet acceptance, the understanding that intelligence without humility becomes a liability, that control without truth becomes a trap, and that the criminal who believes he is smarter than the detectives is often the one who gives them everything they need, simply by continuing to talk long after silence would have been the smarter choice.